NATO countries have differences in relation to Ukraine, but they're minor differences. NATO countries are adamant, are determined that Russia will not win in terms of its aggression against Ukraine. Of course, some countries will favor a diplomatic solution, but no country is pushing for a diplomatic solution so long as Russia is in control of so much Ukrainian territory. Well, Russia's reaction has been angry, and it has said that they will take countermeasures. Now, the countermeasures that they will take is the increase over time in their military preparations, in their military presence along the Finnish border. I'm afraid this is an inevitable consequence of Mr. Putin's miscalculation in terms of invading Ukraine. And so the Finns, the Finnish people, have gone against their natural non-alignment and neutrality. Putin didn't expect that. And now Russia is faced not just with the issue of Ukraine, but it'll be faced with a stronger NATO on its borders, which is the very thing that it didn't want. So it's been a huge miscalculation on the part of Russia. NATO countries are hoping that Turkey, in particular Mr. President Erdogan, will relent and allow Sweden in July, after the Turkish elections in July, when NATO has its next summit meeting in Lithuania. And so NATO countries are hoping that that will happen, and Sweden is ready to be a member of NATO. Yes, but Hungary is hiding behind Turkey. Hungary does have problems with Ukraine, and Hungary has hidden behind Turkey in terms of its positions in Sweden and Ukraine. But Hungary will not hold out if Turkey agrees. So it's Hungary has just shown solidarity to Turkey, but if Turkey softens its position in relation to Sweden, then Hungary will accept, just as it accepted Finland. Well, I think there's a frustration among NATO countries, particularly northern NATO countries, northern European countries, in relation to Turkey. Those countries regard Turkey as a valuable ally, but in Madrid summit in 2022, all countries agreed that Russia was the most immediate threat that NATO faces. Mr. Erdogan agreed that Russia is the most immediate threat that NATO faces. And so NATO countries, and particularly the United States, are really frustrated because Sweden will be a very powerful addition to NATO's strength. And Turkey is holding against that, and it's a contradiction. So Turkey is an anomaly, according to these other NATO allies. Well, NATO internally has always had these tensions and differences. The invasion of Ukraine by Russia has united the allies to one extent, but it has highlighted the differences between particularly France and the United States on the other hand. And France wanted and still wants not to separate Europe and the EU from NATO, but it wants Europe to be a firm partner with the United States and to express its own positions when Europe's interests are different from the United States. And so France, to an extent Spain, to an extent Italy, and ambiguously Germany wants a stronger Europe within NATO in order to resist policies of the United States, which and pressures of the United States to do what is against European interests. So they want a partnership with the United States, but they want a more equal partnership with the United States. And that's the tension which has always been at the heart of the alliance, but it's in recent years, it's been more important. The EU as well has given a huge amount of equipment, but also financial assistance. So, the extent of supplies to Ukraine has been enormous. But the problem has been not the extent, but the timing. Mm-hmm. Ukraine has wanted much more sooner than NATO countries has been able to supply. So it's from the Ukrainian perspective, it's they demand, they ask, they request, but it's always delayed. So it's too little, too late from a Ukrainian perspective. But 1 year on, as you can see, the equipment supplies have been enormous, huge, and it's going to make this Ukrainian counteroffensive more effective than it would otherwise be. Well, I think this will be a problem because the European allies, and to an extent Americans, but especially the European allies, have little more to offer Ukraine. They've made so much effort that they've almost exhausted what they can effectively achieve. And this counteroffensive that's going to happen, that Ukraine will attack Russian forces in Ukraine in the next few weeks. This counteroffensive has been supplied deliberately by the European allies and the Americans and Canadians in order to achieve a breakthrough. If that breakthrough does not happen, then I don't see how much more the Europeans particularly can supply the Ukrainians, because they've almost exhausted their spare supplies. Well, we don't know. Russia has withstood the sanctions better than most observers and analysts thought, but it's still having an effect on Russia. It's corroding its economy, and its growth is nowhere near what it needs to sustain a long, drawn-out war. But Russia is determined to fight this war and to win this war, and it has superior resources to Ukraine. So that's why the Ukrainians are hoping, and the West is hoping, that Russia will be effectively defeated and pushed back from Ukraine this summer. Yes, Russia has succeeded in not isolating itself and making relationships, stronger relationships with China, with India, with other countries, with Iran. But these countries are also watching carefully, because for them, they don't know what the outcome of this war will be. And although they are not isolating Russia, and they're to an extent friendly with Russia, they also fear the European and American strength. So they're hedging. They're careful not to support Russia as the West is supporting Ukraine. They're supporting it politically and making appeals for peace, but they're not supporting China, India, are not supporting Russia militarily. I don't think so. The extreme right is not so extreme in terms of the political parties in power. Mrs. Meloni, for example, there were fears that she was in Italy so-called extreme right, but she is very moderate in her political and international position, and has not broken or with the EU, hasn't confronted the EU or NATO and so on in relation to Ukraine. So I don't think that will happen. A bigger problem, I think, is the turbulence and the political division in the United States. I think European right-wing parties are just the ebb and flow, the swing between left and right that Europe has always had. But the situation in the United States is extremely serious. Well, I think if this war in Ukraine persists into next year and even the year after, I think there will be exhaustion. The economic situation in Europe is difficult, but not disastrous. And I think Europeans generally hope that this war will finish and things will be back to normal. There is no sign at the moment of extreme agitation, protests in terms of the economic situation, except in France, but that's a specific case in terms of pension reform. Why? Because Mr. Macron is unpopular and he's circumvented the democratic process, in my view, in terms of imposing this pension reform, which is a moderate pension reform, just raising the age of people's retirement by a couple of years. But he's mishandled his relationship with the French people. Yes, I worked for NATO 20 years. I worked for the British Ministry of Defence for 22 years. And I have been involved in NATO since 1975. So there was one big change, which was the Cold War. After the Cold War, and NATO reduced its armaments and became more political as a result of Russian actions in Crimea and aggression against Ukraine. We're returning to what NATO was in the Cold War. And so that is a significant swing back to what NATO was in the Cold War. But because NATO, since the Cold War, has many new members, the gravity and decision-making has changed. And the Central and Eastern European countries, the former Warsaw Pact countries, Poland, the Czech Republic, Hungary, the Baltic states, have much more influence and interests, separate interests, than the past. They have swung NATO to a hardline position against Russia. When I say hardline, it's a justifiable hardline because of their fears of Russia. Mm-hmm. But in the past, in the Cold War, NATO sought dialogue with the Soviet Union. Now, NATO, it's difficult to see NATO conducting a real dialogue with Russia. Well, I think the countries of North Africa, for example, have relationships with NATO. And NATO military cooperation will continue, not in high profile, but will continue. But what NATO is doing presently is working out its relationship with China, and particularly the countries like Japan and Australia, Korea, South Korea, New Zealand, who are wary of China, and NATO is making closer relationships with those countries in order to hedge against China challenging the world order. Yes, it may, and it is. But China is not considered as a threat, and NATO will not take military action or preparations against China. But what it wants to do is encourage China, because it will be more and more powerful, to take a more constructive in its region, to take a more friendly, cooperative role in its region towards the countries who fear it, like Japan. Mm-hmm. But NATO wants to encourage China to play a constructive as opposed to an affirmative zero-sum game role in the Far East. I don't think we're in danger of a world war. Mm-hmm. I think we're in danger of escalation in Ukraine, but it will probably be contained in Ukraine. There's too much in terms of war in China and so on. There's too much at stake. There are too many economic interests. There's too much incentive to cooperate economically. The West depends on China, and China depends on the West economically. So I think that's that poses a limit towards any aggression or tension, huge, big tension between China